Oh, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. I got a new phone. Two, three. No, I'm Mr. DeMille. Is it? You know what? I'm not gonna explain it. Two, three. Biddy boop bop beep beep boo. Boo doo 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 doo. Do 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 do. Hi, my name is Jimmy. I went to the comic book store today. Picks of the week. Betty Bada Badoo. Like, why did I even make this sign if you can't even see it now? New phone, how rude. So this week, I didn't get anything that I haven't already discussed, I don't think. I also keep looking at the wrong place for the camera. Uh, what do you want? It was kind of a lighter-ish week. I mean, next week should be dead. I've just been really broke lately, so I'm just kind of sweating it. I mean, did I spend more on groceries than on comic books this week? For once, yes. All right, so first up, we got Maestro number 5. I don't know if I talked about this one when it first came out. So, as you can see, that's an elderly the Hulk. So back in the early 90s, I want to say, Peter David wrote a Hulk story called Future Imperfect, and it was a 2-issue prestige edition, which means it was square bound, and the cover was kind of, what do they call that when it's like raised? You know what I mean? The Hulk is coming at you, and then it's kind of anyway. And it was really good, and it was drawn by Dale Keown, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and Dale Keown was one of Peter David's better known, because this was back when Peter David was writing the regular Hulk title, and Dale Keown was drawing it, I believe. This is where Dale Keown bailed to go to Image with his not as successful Hulk book called Pit. But I digress. So Days of Future Past, Days of Future Past is the X-Men. Future Imperfect is the Hulk thing. Is that right? I think that's right. Maybe there's another series called Future. Thinking of. Regardless, this story took place in the distant future, dystopian future, after all the superheroes and most of the villains have been killed. Yet another one of those dystopias. And the Hulk has found himself now Yeah, that's right. In the original story, it's a dystopian future run by an old Hulk. The Hulk of the early 90s ends up in that timeline for some reason, and he has a big fight with his older alternate timeline self. That character, though, has remained of interest. Like, that story, even though it was only 2 issues, became a very popular story of Peter David, certainly. And that's, I mean, he had one of what many I would definitely consider best runs on that title in its history. And then, I don't, this is the first sequel they've done that I'm aware of, but Maestro showed up in the Old Man Logan title about 3 years ago, because Old Man Logan was also from a dystopian future in which all the superheroes and most of the villains had been killed, but this was a different one. It was one where the Hulk only ends up running the western part of the United States instead of the whole world. But I think it was Ed Brisson who was writing for Marvel a lot back then, and whose name I don't see anymore these days. He used Maestro in that title, like in a weird crossover, where like in Old Man Logan, that the Hulk in that timeline meets an untimely end, or some would say all too timely. So Maestro decides he's going to bail on his own dystopian timeline and take over this one. It's all so silly and stupid. It's just like a comic book, a superhero comic book, anyway. So this is actually what you would call a prequel. This story has thus far, anyway, been from when the Hulk very first arrives in this timeline, and he finds Hercules is actually in. He's the Maestro. Oh yeah, this is not actually. I don't want anyone to get confused. This is not a Mark Metcalf crossover. It's a deep cut. But yeah, it's good. Also this week, I got Grendel, Kentucky number 4. This is the first I realized that this was a 4-issue series, but I'm not totally surprised. Like the way, and I think I've mentioned this before, the way they do comic book stories now, they're all pretty much 4 to 6 issue series. Sometimes they keep the same title. Sometimes they keep, like, I bet you the next Grendel Kentucky series will be like Year Zero. It'll just be Volume 2 or whatever. Which I don't care for, if I'm being 100% honest. It's like, it started anyway as another way to get number ones out there. And I mean, I think that's mostly the logic behind continuing to do that now. Instead of putting out Grendel Kentucky number 5, they put out Grendel Kentucky Volume 2 number 1. And people who aren't looking very closely are going to go, "Ooh, a number 1." But that's the other thing. I mean, because I don't even think this, it's not even a speculator thing so much as it is people don't want to get scared off of, people will get scared off of reading a series if it's in the middle, which I can relate to. I used to feel that way too until I kind of came back around to accepting the way comic book stories are told are not necessary. You don't necessarily need to read them in order unless you're really dumb. And I'm only kind of dumb, so there. But this has been really, really good. I don't think I even mentioned it when the first issue came out. If you can tell by the title, it's a reference to Beowulf. It's an updated telling of the Beowulf story, where this young lady, Marnie Wallace, takes up the Beowulf role. And it also revolves around the pot business in Kentucky, which is pretty lucrative from what I understand. Similar in essence to the old moonshine sort of way they did business back then. But it's been really good. And then there's a monster in the woods that's killing everybody, like in Beowulf. And so, yeah, so far it's been great. And it's also, yes, it was also, it's written by Jeff McComsey, whose name I don't know from anything else. But it's drawn by Tommy Lee Edwards, who I do know from other things, but I couldn't tell you the titles off the top of my head. He's got a very realism. I was going to say realistic, but it's not that realistic. He's got a very similar style to your Mike Deodato's and, well, to an extent, your Simone Bianchi's. They're like realistic. Like when Marvel did their Marvel 1985 book, which was very similar to Donny Cates' current book Crossover, where Marvel superheroes and villains found themselves in our world, the actual world. And Tommy Lee Edwards drew that, and that was a wise choice, is my point. And then finally this week, I can talk a little bit longer because the phone's not full of all the other apps that I usually put on there. Aren't you relieved? Okay. Comic Book History of Animation number 2. This one featuring the Warner Brothers Studios would be my guess, given the... Yeah. I know I just mentioned it like 2 weeks ago whenever the first issue came out. It's not... I don't think it's even been a month since the first issue came out. The only reason I even mention it now is because I don't know if you're hip to this, but my friend, the very funny and talented John Pridmore, introduced me this past week to a fellow named Dave Lee on the YouTubes. He goes by Dave Lee Down Under. I think he's Australian or something. Is that right? Look that up. Canada? He's from Canada. But he has these incredible videos called Cartoon Evolution, or Evolution as they say. And where he takes one character, say your Bugs Bunny or your Daffy Duck, and he gives you a rundown of from start to finish, from the first inception of the character right up till modern time. Or some of them are from last summer, but you get the point. And honestly, I have not been sucked into like a show for some time. I know it's not your typical TV show. And there's only a few, I only have a few left, and they're mostly for characters I don't really care about. But I watched the Daffy Duck one, and I watched the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner one, and I watched the Bugs Bunny one. Most of your top level, Porky Pig I just watched today. Most of your top level Warner Brothers guys. And then he's got stuff like, he had one on Popeye that I watched. He has one on Felix that I haven't watched yet. One on Betty Boop I haven't watched yet. So like really, and he knows his stuff. And I used, like I mentioned with this book, I used to be gung-ho into animation. I'm not nearly as much as I used to be. But I still love Looney Tunes, and you know, what they call the golden age of animation is already my preferred era. So that's where this guy talks a lot about. He also talks a lot about Space Jam because he's 10 years younger than me. Anyway, that picks up like Dave Lee Down Under. That's, did I say that? Picks up last week. Okay. Holy moly! All right. I didn't get I had time off. I had a whole week off, and I didn't get any comic book reading done because I've been. Oh, I'll show you this book. This is your. Why am I doing your job? I've also. This is mostly what I've been reading this week. Detroit '67, the year that changed soul by Stuart Cosgrove. If you're not into soul music at all, and I've been getting super duper into it over the last couple of years, this year in particular, but really over the last couple of years. It's first part in a trilogy. Second part is Memphis in '68, and then Harlem in '69, and it is largely unputdownable. I don't know how into soul music you might be, but if you're into pop culture bullshit or anything like that, this is all about Motown, obviously, because it's in Detroit. But holy mole, holy mole! I mean, I never saw Dreamgirls or any of that stuff, but I had heard the stories about Berry Gordy and the Supremes and all that, but woo, I had no idea. So that's why I didn't get any comic books read. I would highly recommend that book as well. But the comic books I did get read were as follows: Solid Blood number 17, and as I was telling you last week, this is the only issue of Solid Blood that's ever actually been published. It's a crossover with the book Crossover that I mentioned earlier, the Donny Cates book. Is it me, or do I look like a ghost that is going through his third divorce? I have got to get a haircut in this quarantine, for the love of Mike. And they did. So this is Robert Kirkman and Ryan Ottley, who Robert Kirkman is one of the co-creators of The Walking Dead, and he writes a lot of other stuff. Him and Ottley have a book together. I don't know which one it is though, because honestly, I have enjoyed what I've read of Kirkman's work, except for The Walking Dead, and but not enough to like seek it out. I only bought this because it crossed over with Crossover, and also it was a great bit. So they did this. It was still $4, but they did it like an early 90s Image comic. If you've ever read an early 90s Image comic, this is pretty much what every single cover looked like from about Wildcats 3 or 4, or certainly by the time Brigade was a monthly book, this is what every single cover looked like. And the characters in the story are as thin and not very good as it was back then. It was very nostalgic. The pages are all newsprint, and the color was like not necessarily for color, because they had a little better printing in the early 90s, but still, it's very much a throwback. And in the back matter, the letters page, Kirkman talks about how excited he is to continue this book. And I don't remember a Crossover even being mentioned. One of the characters in this book is in Crossover, if I'm not very much mistaken, but she doesn't make any reference to that at all, because I think all this in this book happens before the events of Crossover. But it was really fun. And the funnest part was, and what really kind of confirms that it's like an alternate universe type thing, is in the letters page, Kirkman talks about how excited he is to have the book make it to 17, and ostensibly it's going to make it to 25. And he says, well, this book didn't make it, and then started The Walking Dead, and that only lasted 10 issues. And then, so it's like, oh, I see. This is a universe wherein Robert Kirkman is not nearly as filthy rich as he is in this one. And speaking of making Robert Kirkman more money, I also bought and read Reckless by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. This, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, well, my friend Mary Jane French, the very funny and talented Mary Jane French, and I have a twice a week podcast where we watch sitcoms episode by episode and sort of recap them. And right now, one of the shows we're working on is Better Off Ted, which was on the ABC network about 10 years ago, only lasted 2 seasons. And it was one of Midgie's favorites already, and I had never even heard of it. It is one of the best sitcoms I've ever seen, hands down. It's very, very funny. It's on Hulu if you're into it. And you can also listen to Upstream with Jimmy and Midge and listen to us watch it. One of the things about that show, though, and that Mary Jane and I kind of come to every week, is we just kind of, because at the end of every episode we give, the episode a numerical value. And it's like, we always just go, well, it's a 9, it's another 9, because 10 is obviously like, 10 we reserve for when it's really good. But it's like 8 or 9, it's every time, because it's just like, it's almost boring how good it is. That's how the Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips team is. These guys put out so much quality stuff. It's putting me to sleep. I'm kidding, of course. Please don't ever stop. I had also read about this earlier in the year and forgotten, but this is the first in a series. So since the world went off its goddamn spindle this year. Brubaker was like, well, we can't do monthly comics like we were used to. This is in the beginning of the quarantine when there were no comic books being distributed and nobody knew at the time when it would. So he started writing this, and he wanted to do essentially what Matt Kindt kind of wanted to do with Bang this year also, is create another, like a God, I thought there was a more specific term, but like the men's adventure fiction, specifically of like the 60s and 70s, where it wasn't quite as black and white. Those were huge. And Brubaker's dad used to read a lot of them. And that really influenced him heavily in getting into crime fiction in general and in writing this. So Ethan Reckless is our hero. And he's kind of like the Equalizer, if you ever saw that show with the old white guy. And then they made a couple movies out of it with Denzel Washington, where basically he's kind of just like a hero for hire, kind of like Luke Cage a little bit too. You call a number and you tell your sad story, and if Ethan Reckless figures he can help you and the price is right, he'll do it. So this is when we first meet him, and this takes place in 1981. It's a beautiful book too. Like, it's just really nice looking. The color scheme and everything else, which doesn't surprise me because these guys are very thorough. I think, in fact, Sean Phillips, Jacob Phillips does the colors, and he's Sean Phillips' boy, and he also draws a very good crime comic book called That Texas Blood, which just ended recently. So yeah, he's got 2 more of these are in the hopper for next year, and boy, I can't wait. It's $25, which is a bit, but also it may not seem like it, but usually I burn through these like with pulp. Where did that go? I did this last week. I got pulp. Oh, it's right here. So pulp is, it's not way thinner, but it's a bit thinner. This is one of the thicker standalones that they've done. And usually I read pretty quickly, especially comics, and I usually burn through things, and I did not burn through this. It read perfectly. It's so good. I mean, it's just, if you like crime fiction, hell, if you like any kind of fiction, but especially crime fiction, anything Brubaker and Phillips does, you must have. I guess that's everything. Picks of last week. Like, I'm disappointed that I only went 18 minutes. Okay, I gotta go. Can you get the bandsaw going? Because we gotta get rid of this face. No, the grinder. Yeah, you got it.